Continuação da leitura do livro The Map, é o capítulo 13, e no caso a leitura está em inglês, que é o idioma original do livro. Então, o capítulo 13 fala Oil and the State. The US EU sanctions, as well as those of other countries, including Japan and Norway, had been imposed at a time of high oil prices and expectations of a continuing tight market. But then, in late 2014, the oil price collapsed, delivering a new shock to a Russian economy and national budget so heavily dependent on oil. A severe crisis seemed inevitable, and indeed, the initial impact was great. Capital flight, drying up of both foreign and domestic investment, loss of access to international capital markets, plummeting spending by consumers, and declining GDP. But the shock was cushioned by the policies of Russian central bank. It closed insolvent banks, including those owned by powerful figures, and allowed the ruble, the coin in Russia, to float. The currency lost more than half its value against the dollar, but this flexibility helped to steady the economy. Expenditures by the Russian government are largely in rubles. Thus, a fall of 50% in dollar revenues from oil would, roughly speaking, still convert into the same amount of rubles within Russia as prior to the collapse. The devaluation was a great boost to a Russian oil industry. It received dollars from its exports, but most of its expenditures on workers and equipment were devalued rubles, and so the collapsing oil price had very little effect on industry activities within Russia. Indeed, between 2014 and 2016, Russian oil output increased. Imported goods became much more expensive for Russian consumers, who were paid in what were now devalued rubles, and they cut away back on such purchases. At the same time, owing to the fall in the ruble, domestically produced Russian goods were now much more competitive, not only domestically but internationally. This applied to both manufacturers and agriculture. In the latter case, also aided by far-reaching reforms in the farming sector. Russia became the largest exporter of wheat in the world, quite a turnaround from the 70s, when the Soviet Union spent a good part of its oil earning buying wheat from the United States. Moreover, in retaliation for the sanctions, the Russian government imposed sanctions of its own, banning food imports from Europe. This proved to be a great boon for Russian farmers. But other parts of the economy were much threatened. The closing of international capital markets put Russian financial institutions and companies that had borrowed in dollars or euros in the precarious position of not being able to meet their debt payments. The Kremlin stepped in with an anti-crisis program that provided subsidies and funding. To do so, it drilled down its sovereign wealth funds. Those funds had been built up over several years by Alexei Kudrin, finance minister from 2000 to 2011. He had been seared by the 1998 crisis when the Russian economy went into free fall and the government ran out of money. Kudrin had long been criticized for socking away some of Russia's large oil earnings into sovereign wealth funds and paying off its foreign debt, instead of spending the money right away. But now, the wisdom of the rainy day funds was being proved. A visitor remarked to Kudrin that people must be thanking him for his prescience and insistence. He managed a small smile. Not enough, he said. He was still being attacked. Yet, when it was all added up, the Russian economy proved more resilient to the sanctions and oil price collapsed than had been expected. By 2017, the economy had crawled back into positive economic growth, and by 2019 it was growing at 1.6%. Yet the crisis had demonstrated once again the risks of being so reliant on oil. Hopes for economic reform were derailed, like to leave its tracks, in part by the plethora of sanctions, like a large amount of sanctions and disengagements from the global economy, and by the domestic vested interests that would be challenged by reform. The new isolation instead made companies more dependent on the state and expanded the role of the government in the national economy. The hopes for reinvigorating economic growth now largely rested with a series of national projects aimed at a wide array, including infrastructure, health, and education. These are government initiatives with a considerable commitment to spending. The Russian economy was returning to state control. Reform would once again have to wait. Eu vou continuar com o capítulo 14, porque esse capítulo 13 foi curto. Chapter 14, Pushback. In late 2015, 4 years after Nord Stream started operating, surveyors began to map out a second pipeline route under the Baltic Sea from Russia to Germany. Opposition to Nord Stream 2, as it was known, was much stronger than against the original Nord Stream. Part of the reason was that had happened in between, specifically Ukraine. Criticism came from parts of Europe, notably Poland and the Baltic countries, as well as European Union itself. A turnaround from its supportive position on the original Nord Stream. Donald Tusk, president of the EU Council, was already warning. Excessive dependence on Russian energy makes Europe weak. Maros Sefcovic, EU Vice President, put Nord Stream 2 high on the list of hybrid threats. That was not, however, for how other Europeans, including German Chancellor Angela Merkel, saw Nord Stream 2. It was a commercial project, she said, and up to the companies involved, Gazprom and its European partners. In March 2017, the first pipe arrived at the logistics hub in Germany. But the proponents of Nord Stream 2 had not factored in what was unfolding in Washington. Donald Trump came into the presidency determined to set a new course on Russia. During the election campaign, he had praised Putin as a strong leader, exuberantly declaring that Putin had called him a genius. Putin has used the word yarky, which translates as bright, as in eye-catching or shiny. Trump, however, was running in his own lane, and Russia had become a bitterly divisive subject in Washington. A joint task force from the CIA, the National Security Agency, and the FBI concluded the Russian government pursued a multifaceted influence campaign in the 2016 election that included aggressive use of cyber capabilities, and that President Putin directed and influenced the campaign to erode the faith and confidence of the American people in the presidential election process and demean Secretary Clinton and advantage to Mr. Trump. Putin certainly did not hide his distaste for Clinton. It was mutual. She had said of Putin that as a former KGB agent, by definition, he doesn't have a soul. After the outcome of 2011 parliamentary elections in Russia sparked demonstrations, she charged the Kremlin with electoral fraud. In response, Putin accused her of paying anti-Kremlin demonstrators in Moscow. In Washington, after Trump's victory in the 2016 election, Russia and Russian intervention in that election was a dominant theme, and the authoritarian nature of the government and corruption a constant refrain. In an effort to do something, the US Congress passed myriad new sanctions targeting individuals said to be close to Putin, and companies and financial institutions. Some aimed to further constrain Russian energy projects and limit Western participation in them. Normally, US sanctions legislation permits presidential discretion so that they can adjust it as a policy tool in response to changes on the part of the sanctioned country. But controversial in terms of presidential authority, some of these new sanctions were written permanently into law, eliminating that flexibility. This prevents current or future administrations from using them as leverage in negotiations or to affect behavior. History demonstrates that sanctions written into law without presidential discretion are not easily removed. The Jackson-Vanik Amendment passed in 1974 to support Jewish emigration from the Soviet Union remained on the books for the 38 years, although by then the Soviet Union had long ceased to exist and Russia's compliance with the law had been certified many years before. These new congressional prohibitions were testaments to the general hostility towards Russia and among Democrats, continuing rancor over Russian interference in the 2016 election, and to deep distrust of the Trump administration and the Trump himself. That point was noted by Rosneft CEO Igor Sechin, who said, "Sometimes it seems to me that sanctions are imposed on him, not us." Trump signed major sanctions legislation in August 2017, though he called it seriously flawed, like having a mistake, because it encroached on presidential authority. But he found a novel source for the authority beyond the Constitution, and he said, "I built a truly great company worth many billions of dollars. That is a big part of the reason I was elected. As president, I can make better deals with foreign countries than Congress." Nord Stream 2 was targeted in several pieces of proposed legislation. There was an assumption, among those some in Washington, that if the pipeline was not built, it would reduce Russian gas going into Europe. But that was not correct. The gas would simply flow through other pipelines, including those in Ukraine and Turkey. While the eastern members of the European Union wanted new sanctions aimed at stopping Nord Stream 2, the rest of the continent reacted differently. Europe's energy supply is a matter for Europe, not the United States of America, said Germany's foreign minister and Austria's chancellor in a joint statement. Instruments for political sanctions should not be tied to economic interests. It was difficult for Europeans to see the connection between Russia meddling in US elections and the natural gas pipeline in Europe. There had to be another explanation. The head of one of Europe's largest energy companies suggested that the sanctions were a way for the United States to try to favor its own gas, that is, export of LNG from the United States. Germany's foreign minister said the same thing. And this reading was not without reason, for the 2017 legislation called the export of the United States energy resources to create American jobs. Wolfgang Schiller, the chairman of the Munich Security Conference and the former German ambassador to the United States, observed that Americans would be highly heated, like angry, were Brussels to pass legislation to block an oil pipeline from Canada to the United States. Ischinger also pointed to a fundamental lesson of sanctions. They are more likely to succeed when they are multilateral. Unilateral sanctions create rancor among allies, and the biggest beneficiary of conflict between the United States and the EU over sanctions would be Russia, which would warmly welcome a more divided West. The outlines of a deal over Nord Stream 2, at least in Europe, were becoming evident. The pipeline was not just an economic project, said Chancellor Merkel. It is in the spring of 2018. Of course, political factors must also be taken into account. What she had in mind specifically was that certain amount of gas would be guaranteed to flow through the Ukrainian system. For its part, Gazprom signaled that it would maintain some level of exports through Ukraine, but in Washington, 39 senators called on the administration to stop Nord Stream 2 because it would make Europe more susceptible to Moscow's coercion and malign influence, like bad influence. It turned out to be that the bluntest critic of Nord Stream 2 was Donald Trump. Across a breakfast table from NATO, OTAN, Secretary General, he declared Germany is totally controlled by Russia because they are getting 60 to 70% of their energy from Russia in a new pipeline. You tell me if that's appropriate. I think it's not. He wasn't finished. Germany is a captive of Russia, he added. At this, Chancellor Merkel took personal umbrage, having grown up in communist East Germany under the omniscient eye of Stasi secret police. I have experienced myself how a part of Germany was controlled by the Soviet Union, she shot back. I am very happy that today we are united in freedom and can make our independent policies and make independent decisions. Russian pipelines supply about a third of Europe's gas, but LNG and interconnected pipelines within Europe make the market competitive. Not deterred, Trump renewed the attack via Twitter. What good is NATO, OTAN, if Germany is paying Russia billions of dollars for gas and energy? Meeting with the European Commission's president, he promised that the United States would sell massive amounts of LNG to Europe, yet around that time, in the shallow waters of Lubmin. Uau, a bateria está acabando. Então, só um minuto. A year and a half later, in December 2019, the $11 billion pipeline was only weeks away from completion, and on December 9, Putin was in Paris to meet with German Chancellor Angela Merkel, French President Emmanuel Macron, and Volodymyr Zelensky, the new president of Ukraine. Zelensky had become famous in Ukraine for his popular television comedy show Servant of the People, in which he played a school teacher who accidentally becomes Ukraine's president. Now he actually was president, elected with 72% of the votes in April 2019. Zelensky described this, his first meeting with Putin, as a tie for now. A week later, on December 17th, the US Senate passed a multi-billion-dollar defense bill. Sanctions on Nord Stream 2 were tacked onto it. 3 days later, on December 20, to the surprise of many, word got out that Russia and Ukraine had concluded a settlement of what had seemed to be their endlessly acrimonious natural gas battle. It was more than a tie. It was the deal that Ukraine could only have hoped for. Russia guaranteed 5 years of volume of natural gas to Europe through Ukraine, which would assure a level of transit revenues. Even more surprising, Russia agreed to pay Ukraine a $3 billion arbitration claim that Ukraine had won against Gazprom. That was roughly equivalent to 1 year of transit revenues to Kiev. Some few hours after the Russians and the Ukrainians had finally settled their long-running conflict, Donald Trump at Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland on his way to Florida signed the defense bill imposing sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. The sanctions targeted just on one company, a Swiss firm that owned the pipeline barge, at the time the only one of its kind in the world equipped for this project. The barge stopped work almost at once, and the company had no choice but to comply. Both Germany and the European Union expressed outrage and what they saw as extraterritorially and America's illegally intervening in Europe's domestic affairs. This is a very important project, said Chancellor Merkel. It has been legitimated by the new European law, and we need to carry it through. For its part, Gazprom responded that it would finish laying the pipe itself, but not quickly. It had already bought a pipeline barge as a precaution, but it would take many months to properly outfit the ship for the job. These were new legal challenges and threats of new sanctions. And there, in the meantime, at the bottom of the Baltic Sea, Nord Stream 2 lay in a state of suspended animation, almost but not quite finished. Whatever the pipeline route, Europe would need additional natural gas imports to make up for declining domestic supplies. The Groningen gas field in the north of Holland, discovered in 1959, was the biggest domestic source of gas within Europe and the foundation of which the original European gas system has been built. It still ranks among the top 10 gas fields in the world, but its days are numbered. Owing to its particular geology, production over many years has led to subsidence, sinking of the topsoil, which has triggered tremors and earthquakes, causing cracks and damaging houses. The Dutch government has imposed severe restrictions on production and a likely total shutdown by 2022. This would not affect new discoveries on the Netherlands offshore, but it would mean that Europe would lose what has been the largest domestic source of gas. Europe will need additional imports. Some will come from Azerbaijan through a new pipeline system that reaches into Italy. Some might come from Israel and Cyprus. Some would come from LNG. But Russian gas, whatever the route, would also benefit from the declining domestic production. Yet the concern about Russia's potential leverage from gas exports does not fully recognize how much both of the European and the world gas markets have changed. The gas market in Europe has become a real market of buyers and sellers rather than a system based on inflexible long-term contracts. And LNG has become a truly global industry, one that, declares the European Union, can give a real boost to Europe's diversity of supply and hence greatly improve energy security. There already were a number of terminals in Western Europe to receive the LNG, regasify it and inject it into the European pipeline system. But not in Eastern Europe. The first country to remedy this was Lithuania, which was completely dependent on Russian gas and was paying higher prices than other countries. It opened its first LNG receiving terminal in 2014, and at the ceremony, the country's president described the facility as a guarantee not only of our energy but also of our economic independence. She added that Russia would no longer be able to exert political pressure by manipulating gas prices. Just to be sure that no one missed the point, the terminal was christened Independence. Lithuania's energy minister tried to be a little more diplomatic. The Russians are very good people, but it is difficult to negotiate with them, he said. We built a small LNG terminal to have a stronger position in negotiations with them, and it worked. Gazprom reduced its price. A year later, Poland also, until then, totally dependent of Russian gas, opened a much larger LNG import terminal. Europe now has more than 30 receiving terminals for LNG, which can be ramped up on short notice. They are also part of an increasingly dense global network. Worldwide, over 40 countries now import LNG, compared to just 11 in 2000. In the year 2000, exporting countries have increased from 12 to 20. Overall global LNG demand in 2019 was almost 4 times larger than in 2000, and liquefaction capacity is expected to increase by another 30% over the next half decade. Methane molecules from a growing number of countries now jostle and compete with one another for customers across the globe. European buyers today have choices in the new competitive global market. They will put together portfolios of pipeline gas and LNG that fit their needs and economics and their risk calculations. So long as warfare continues in Ukraine, politics will fuel rancorous discussion of European gas. But with Europe now part of the global market, political risk is draining out of Europe's gas supply. Ukraine is no longer directly dependent on Russian gas, but rather imports gas that may or may not be Russian molecules through Slovakia, Hungary, and Poland. Moreover, domestic production supplies about 2/3 of total demand, and the share could go higher, as Ukraine may possess the largest natural gas resources of any country in Europe. Some 80% of current production comes from the state-owned gas company, the second largest among the private firms in a company called Burisma. It represents just 5% of domestic production, but it has gained oversized fame outside the energy sector. It is a company that Donald Trump wanted investigated in Ukraine, owing to the fact that Hunter Biden, son of the former Vice President Joe Biden, sat on its board. It was that famous quid pro quo linking the provision of US aid to an investigation of a company and the Biden connections that became the basis for the impeachment of Trump in 2019. A surprising new competitor to Gazprom has entered the LNG business within Russia itself. Since 2009, Russia has been exporting LNG from its Far East island of Sakhalin, north of Japan. Yet vast volumes of natural gas had been discovered in the Yamal and Jidan peninsulas above the Arctic Circle. The reserves in the southern part of Yamal Peninsula are or can be connected by pipeline for export, but it was assumed that the huge reserves in the frozen northern part of Yamal would never be developed because of the remote location and high cost, thus leaving the gas permanently stranded in place. But not quite everyone agreed. Leonid Mikhelson, the CEO of the independent Russian company Novatek, was determined to develop LNG export capacity in the north of Yamal Peninsula. The main inhabitants of this barely populated region are several thousand Nenets, partly nomadic people who move with their reindeer herds, which they supplement by hunting polar bears. In the language of the Nenets, Yamal means end of the land, and that is what the remote northern part in the peninsula literally is, a harsh, vast, bleak and treeless land that just out of the forbidding ice pack of the Arctic Ocean and is underlaid by permafrost. The region is so far north that it is completely cloaked in darkness in the winter and bathed in perpetual polar sunlight during summer. The region in which Yamal LNG intended to operate is 300 miles from North Pole and often unreachable by land and cut off by winds, fog and blinding snow that forces helicopters to turn back mid-flight. temperatures fall below minus 43 degrees Fahrenheit in winter. To bring the LNG industry to that ultra-cold region, all sorts of special equipment and construction techniques had to be developed. There was also virtually no infrastructure at that cost of $30 billion. An entirely new port city of Sabata had to be constructed. And then there's a vast expanse of ocean ice. In addition to nuclear-powered icebreakers, 15 new ice-class tankers had to be designed and built at a cost of $320 million each. To move through the Arctic waters, one advantage of the project, however, is that the extreme cold makes the gas refrigeration process easier than in the hot climate of the Persian Gulf, enabling the units to produce more gas than in their official nameplate maximum capacity. Already very challenging, the project became even more so in 2014 when Ukraine-related sanctions cut off Novatek's access to Western finance. In order to survive, the $27 billion LNG project needed a new injection of money and quickly. The Chinese came through with a $12 billion loan and also became partner in the project, along with the French supermajor Total Energies, which had joined earlier. The Russians had historically been reluctant to allow large-scale Chinese ownership of upstream assets, but now there was no choice. The decision to go ahead with the project in 2013 had been met with much skepticism and doubt in both Russia and the international LNG industry. But by December 2017, the first cargo of LNG was already to leave the new port of Sabata. At the dedication ceremony on a freezing cold day, a parka-clad Putin said that good people and good professionals had warned me, "Do not do this." He pointedly shifted his gaze across the 400 people gathered for the ceremony. The reasons they cited were very serious. Despite the extreme skepticism, he added, "Those who started this project took the risk." He continued, "This is not just an important event in our country's energy sector, but also for developing the Arctic and the Northern Sea route." He added, "All this is interconnected and secure Russia's future." That first cargo was sold on the spot market. It ended up in a British terminal, where it was bought by another company. From there, it became part of a cargo that was rushed to Boston to keep freezing New Englanders warm during unexpectedly cold weather. The arrival of Russian molecules in Boston Harbor created consternation and outrage. One U.S. senator declaimed that the landing of the molecules, even though no longer Russians owned and intermixed with molecules from other countries, undermined broader foreign policy goals regarding Russia. But the local utility had no choice but to buy whatever cargo was available, as the deep freeze threatened to leave the region short of heat. During the cold snap, said the utility, LNG was absolutely vital in meeting customer needs. Massachusetts sits near the vast volume of inexpensive gas in the Marcellus Shale, which would have enabled it to avoid Russian molecules, but environmental activists and regional politicians have unwaveringly blocked construction of a new pipeline from Pennsylvania. In August 2018, Yamal LNG dispatched its first cargo to China, going east along the Arctic coast through the ice of the Northern Sea route. Yamal LNG had come in on time and on budget. The Financial Times observed another noteworthy aspect of the project. No other business venture, it said, better illustrates Russia's resilience in the face of international sanctions. The path of the tanker also delineated what has become known as the NSR, the Northern Sea Route. This fulfills a major Russian objective, the opening up of a transit route between Europe and Asia through the Arctic Ocean. It has been facilitated by the retreat of the Arctic ice, although with more variability than sometimes recognized. For instance, in September 2014, the ice extent was 50% greater than it had been in September 2012. The route cuts the distance between Shanghai and Rotterdam by about 30%, and in the process avoids both the narrow Malacca Strait and the Suez Canal. This opening has been welcomed by Japan, South Korea, and especially by China, which, describing itself as the near Arctic state, applies its own distinctive name to the route, the Polar Silky Road. Overall, however, the Northern Sea Route is still supplementary owing to the challenges of ice and weather. There is a fee, for instance, for ice breaking, but it is crucial for Yamal LNG, which targets Asia and can deliver LNG to China in just 20 days. But Europe is also a market. This holds out the possibility that the Russian pipeline gas, whether it comes through Ukraine or Nord Stream 2, will face a new competitor in Europe, Russian LNG. LNG projects from Russia Arctic gas make it clear that Russia will become the fourth major pillar for energy supply in the 2020s, along with the United States, Qatar, and Australia. These Arctic projects will give Russia the same advantage that Qatar achieved earlier with this century, the flexibility, as Putin put it, to go either eastward or westward, and Yamal LNG, said Putin, is one of more confirmation that the status of Russia as one of the world's leading energy powers. The development of Arctic LNG also points to a major geopolitical shift with worldwide impact. The Povorot naval stock, Russia's pivot to the east. And that's it. So let's see next chapter, chapter 15, pivoting to the east. Mas aí vai ser no próximo vídeo. Tchau, tchau.